welcome and thank you very much for joining today's webinar. This is the fourth and final webinar in our series delivered in conjunction with Hardian Health on bringing software as a medical device to market. I'm delighted to introduce Hugh Harvey and Ankit Tanna from Hardian Health, who are going to be speaking today on clinical evidence for software devices. So as I mentioned, this concludes our series of webinars, but if you want to catch up on any that you didn't attend, you can find all the recordings on our virtual learning environment, Health Data Research Futures, alongside a series of bite-sized videos from the team at Hardian Health as well. We'll be circulating links to all of these in the post-event email. So just before I hand over to Hugh and Ankit, just a couple of quick housekeeping points. The session is being recorded today and a link will be included in the follow-up email so you can watch that after the event. Please ensure that your microphone is muted when you're not speaking to avoid background noise and any interruptions. Hugh and Ankit will be taking questions throughout the session, so feel free to raise your hand or post in the chat if you have a question. We will also be pausing for a couple of comfort breaks through the session today, and there'll be a dedicated Q&A session also toward the end of the webinar. So I will now hand over to Hugh and Ankit, and I really hope you enjoyed today's session. Thanks.
Thank you, Rosie, and good morning, everybody. Lovely to see so many people and even more joining as we start. Today's session, as Rosie said, is the fourth webinar in this series that we're conducting with HDR UK. And as the slide says, we're going to be focusing on clinical evaluation for software medical devices. It's an important part of the process, and I'm sure many of you will either be thinking about doing clinical investigations or will have started one or have done one. And we're just going to put it into context, the whole clinical journey from product inception through to post-market, and hopefully give you a nice overview of all the points that need to be covered when you're conducting a clinical evaluation according to best practices. So we'll start just by introducing ourselves very briefly. I'm Dr. Harvey. I trained as a radiologist to consultant level. After I completed my training, I did a MD research degree at the Institute of Cancer Research, which is where I learned about best practice for clinical investigations. I've been principal investigator on several multi-site studies. And I'm GCP trained. We'll get on to what that means later, but GCP is a good clinical practice framework that is widely used in the NHS. And since then, I've been helping companies bring clinically evaluated medical devices to market, mainly as part of their regulatory approval process, but also beyond that. And we'll touch on all the points at which clinical evaluation is important throughout this lecture. And now I'll hand over to Ankit to introduce himself.
Morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. My name's Ankit. I'm a senior associate at Hardian. My background is I'm also a medical doctor, practiced medicine for just under 3 years. And alongside my clinical training, I also was involved in developing machine learning tools for Lewy body dementia and Alzheimer's dementia. I've been at Hardian for about a year, and in that time, I've been part of the clinical team, giving input into regulatory submissions and health economic modelling and general strategy as well. It's lovely to be here. Looking forward to answering some of your questions and the rest of the morning.
Fantastic. So let's have a look at what we're going to be talking about. So today's webinar is approximately 3 hours long. So we have until 12 noon today. We're going to split into 3 sections with comfort breaks in between, so you won't be stuck in front of your screen all morning. There'll be a chance to stretch your legs. But the first part is to get the high-level overview of the entire clinical evaluation process. And that starts before you even think about doing a clinical evaluation. And then we're going to talk about all of the key steps, how to plan and perform clinical investigations, how to report them properly, and think a bit about how to align this strategically in the overall products and go-to-market strategy, and also linking a little bit to health economic value, because clinical investigations aren't just an opportunity to collect clinical evidence, You can also collect health economic data at the same time in a well-designed study. Then we'll have a comfort break. And in section 2, we will go through points within the NICE evidence standards framework for software medical devices to show how clinical evaluation fits into their framework as well. Then we'll have another comfort break, and then we'll go through our Q&A session. And we've prepared a case study, but we're also happy to take examples from the audience. If you have a product or an idea for a clinical investigation, then we can talk that through live in front of the audience. So that is the overview, and we'll get cracking on section 1. Please do raise your hand at any point if you would like to ask a question. We will invite you to use your microphone and ask it to the audience. If you are shy, you can just type it into the chat. That's absolutely fine as well. And we'll monitor that chat as we go along, so we can have a bit of interactivity. Sometimes you'll ask a question that we are going to answer later on in the talk, and so we might not answer your question straight away if we think that it's going to be covered at a later point. But feel free to jump in at any point, and we'll get cracking. So, clinical evaluation for software-based medical devices. Obviously, it's important to generate evidence that the thing that you are building works. But you don't just do this in a single study or investigation. You do this over a series of processes, which all together tell a narrative that you have gone from a conceptualization phase all the way through to demonstration of delivering value for a healthcare system. And there are different points in that process that are really critical to understand and get right, especially in the context of regulated medical devices. And I'm just going to pause here and explain a couple of basic bits of terminology. First of all, we don't use the term clinical study or clinical trial. Those are reserved for drugs or randomized control studies involving drugs or other interventions. The actual term for studying the performance of medical devices is a clinical investigation. And this is defined as a CIMD, a clinical investigation for a medical device. So those of you who have done GCP training might be familiar with the term CTIMP, which is a clinical trial for investigational medical product. We don't use the term trial for medical devices, we use clinical investigation of medical device. So that's an important little nuance to make sure that everyone's on the same page right from the start. But as this diagram shows, you don't just jump in with a clinical investigation. The clinical investigation doesn't come in until point 4 on this list. So there are things to do before you start. So at a very high level, the first thing you need to do before we even think about running any clinical evaluation process is to conceptualize the product or the device that you are ultimately going to be testing. And that has to be done strategically. You must define the intended use. And those of you who attended our regulatory session will have learned a bit more on intended use and how to write a formal intended use statement for your device. But in essence, the intended use describes your device, and we'll come to this in more detail. That's important because if you don't describe your device, exactly what it does, who it's intended for, it's very hard to design a clinical investigation because you don't really know what you're testing to measure and on whom and in which situations. Once you've got an intended use, you have to demonstrate 3 key concepts, which are scientific validity, analytical validity, and clinical validity. And they may sound like they're all the same, but they're not. And we're going to go through what they all mean independently. Once you've done those 3 steps, that's about the point that you might submit for regulatory approval and start putting your device on market and attempting to sell it to healthcare providers. And then you go to steps 5 and 6. So you have post-market. In the regulated medical device sector, it is mandated to record clinical evidence post-market. You can't just put a device on market and leave it running. You have to keep on measuring and monitoring it to make sure it's still safe and effective. And you also have to demonstrate value. It's all very well having a device that can do a clinical function, but it's not going to be a marketable product or a profitable product if it's not delivering some kind of value. And we will talk a little bit about how we might measure that as well in the clinical investigation cycle. So let's start with point one, which is the conceptualization framework in the timeline. So this is overlapping with our regulatory webinar, as I've said, but just to clarify the key points. The regulatory term for what your device does is the intended use. Similar phrase is the intended purpose. They're sort of interchangeable. Intended use and intended purpose mean the same thing. And when you are going to make a regulated medical device, you need a statement called your intended use statement, or IUS. And this is the starting point. Before you design any clinical studies, you have to write down what exactly your device does, and you have to be very specific. And these are the key 6 points that you have to include. You have to include the intended medical indication. So we'll give an example for each one. So the intended medical indication for a software medical device may be asthma, or even more specifically, uncontrolled asthma, or asthma that is resistant to first-line therapy. The intended population must be clearly defined. And this is important because when you're going to design any sort of investigation, you have to make sure you include patients of the age range and demographics that you have included in your intended patient population. So you can't just say, my device is intended for everybody, because that means you would have to design a clinical investigation with a statistically representative proportion of everybody, which is almost impossible to do in trial design. You have to limit it to an age range. So it might be, I don't know, 65 to 75-year-olds. You have to maybe limit it to a gender. You might have to limit it to certain other demographics, such as race or genetic predispositions. So you need to be very clear on the patient population. You also have user groups. So some medical devices are intended to be used by specialist physicians. So it might be a radiology AI system. Obviously, it's intended to be used by radiologists. It might be a patient-facing app where your intended user is actually a patient sitting at home. And you can have primary and secondary users. So some medical devices might measure something, present that measurement to a patient, but then give clinical decision support to a GP, for instance. So you can have a primary and a secondary user. And you can have tertiary and fourth end users as well. So you need to define all those user groups. And again, that is important when you come to trial design. If you're claiming that your device is intended for different user groups, you will need to measure the clinical performance as working alongside those different user groups. You do need to include a statement on which part of the body your device interacts with. For most software devices, we just write not applicable for this because it's software, it's not directly interacting with the body. Though there are some categories of software medical devices which are known as in vitro diagnostic devices. So you might actually be analyzing a genetic profile from a blood sample. So you would write here intended part of the body is blood plasma. And then you need to write down an overarching framework of the operating principle, including where your device fits in a clinical pathway. So if you have a patient-facing app, again, maybe measuring someone's respiratory rate for an asthma app, you have to show where that's fitting in the pathway. Is this before diagnosis, after diagnosis? Is this under the guidance of a general practitioner or a specialist respiratory physician or nurse? Where does it fit in that care pathway? But also, where does it fit in the IT infrastructure as well? So are you sitting in a cloud? Are you sitting separate to NHS IT systems? Are you embedded in an EHR? And you have to also align that with all the relevant cybersecurity principles. Again, for a more detailed look at those, you can refer back to our regulatory seminar. So those are the key points of the intended use. And I think it's very useful. The MHRA themselves have recently released a really good blog on their website defining intended use, specifically around AI-driven software medical devices, which outlines, again, all of these key points very clearly with more fleshed out examples. So I do recommend that, and we'll share that in the materials as well alongside with this webinar. The next part of the intended use statement is to try and define the clinical benefit that your device is intended to provide. And importantly, for clinical investigation design, how are you going to measure that benefit? We see a lot of people come into market saying, you know, we are going to maybe improve turnaround times, or we're going to, you know, reduce the time a doctor takes to do X, Y, or Z task. Well, you have to prove that in your clinical evaluation, and you have to come up with a way to measure it. An important nuance here is that regulators prefer you to measure things using standard measurement metrics. They don't like it when people make up their own measurement scales, because that then requires you to validate your measurement scale separately to the thing that you're measuring, to show that your measurement scale is actually a valid term of measurement. So you have to write down the clear benefits, such as, is this improving a certain outcome, or either a diagnostic outcome or a prognostic or a treatment outcome? And you have to be very, very clear on who that benefit is for, and try and quantify that benefit where you can. You can always come back to your intended use statement once you've got further clinical evidence. So you might not feel like quantifying it straight away before you've done any investigations, but you can come back to the intended use once you have some data to show how much of a benefit you are demonstrating. And really importantly, features do not equal benefits. And what do we mean by that? So a feature might be that you have a nice user interface that's simple to use. That's not a clinical benefit. You can't measure a clinical outcome based on a user interface, for example. Or if you're interacting with an EHR system or an imaging system with a hospital, a feature might be that you have a button that can click so people can report whether they agree or disagree with your software device output. That's a feature, not a benefit. You can't really measure how useful that button is, even though it's important to be there. So you have to be very clear on making sure that your features, your benefits are defined and they're not confused with features. A simple way to think of that is that benefits always in medicine come with risks. If we think about any other medical device that we use, typically in medicine, everything comes with a risk. A thermometer that you can put under the tongue comes with a risk that the thermometer could crack and leak mercury into the mouth. So you have to make sure that you can weigh the benefits against the risks. And the whole point of conducting a clinical evaluation is to prove that your benefits outweigh the risks. So when you're conducting or designing a clinical evaluation, the things you have to think about include measurement of risk versus benefit. So if you were going to conduct an evaluation of, let's say, a thermometer, you would have to make sure that they aren't on average cracking open and leaking mercury into the mouth. And it's the same for software devices. You have to identify your benefits and risks and make sure that you're measuring those in your clinical evaluation. I think that's all we're going to say on intended use, unless anybody has any questions at that point. But again, please do refer to our previous regulatory webinar and the MHRA's recent guidance on intended use for software devices. So now, once you've written down, at least at a high level, exactly what your device does, who it's for, what the benefits and risks are, you've got a clear idea of the intended medical indication, the patient population, etc. Then you have to prove the first of the three key concepts. And the first one is scientific validity. So you're not jumping straight into a clinical investigation just yet. This is where you have to go back to the basic science behind your medical device, the concept of what your device does. Next slide. In essence, you are asking yourself one question. Is there a valid scientific proven association between the outputs of your device and the clinical thing you're trying to measure? You might already know this in your head, that there is a valid association, but you have to prove that, not only to regulators, but obviously ultimately your customers. And what we mean by that is sometimes in software, you can come up with a concept where you think you found a predictor or some kind of biomarker. But you have to actually prove that that biomarker actually does link to a clinical condition, disease, or intervention metric that you can measure. And it's almost impossible to gain regulatory approval for a software-based medical device if you can't prove a link between what your medical device claims to do and an actual clinical target. So the whole point of the scientific validity phase is to slow you down just a little bit in your thinking before you go into clinical investigation to make that scientific link. So there are a couple of ways to demonstrate scientific validity. The first one, which almost every software medical device manufacturer will have to do, and in fact, anybody who's ever done any research should be doing, is do a literature review. It is highly unlikely that you have come up with an entirely novel, an entirely new, unique way of doing something that no one has ever thought about, studied, or done any kind of investigation on. So it's always best to go back to the scientific literature. Science itself is built upon the shoulders of those who came before us. Nobody works in a bubble in science. We all build and share knowledge, hence the reason we publish things. So please do conduct systematic literature reviews, trying to find out the scientific validity of your concept. You can also, in the scientific validity phase, look at your proof of concept studies. So typically during the development of a software medical device, you will have been doing some form of benchmark testing. And for an AI device, this might be when you've taken a data set, split it maybe 80-20% into training and validation data. That early validation can count towards your scientific validity evidence. And the literature review process, combined with this proof of concept study, can provide regulators, yourself and your potential customers, that you have a solid scientific basis for proceeding to an in-human clinical investigation at some point. I'm going to hand over to Anki now. I think he's going to talk a little bit more about the detailed processes of performing a systematic literature review. And please note that a systematic literature review for regulatory purposes can be different to a systematic literature review for pure academic purposes. And he will explain those differences. So Anki, over to you.
Thanks, Hugh. So as Hugh said, for all software devices and all general devices as well, it's really important to conduct a thorough literature review done in a systematic way. And the scope of this review tends to be a little bit broader than the standard systematic reviews that are normally done in academia, and that the aim of the literature review is slightly different. So as we said in the previous slide, the main point of the systematic review is to answer the question, is your technology or whatever algorithm or whatever your software is doing, is it based on sound scientific principles? So in academia, oftentimes systematic reviews are used to collate what might be data which is inconclusive when looked at individually, and then to perform a meta-analysis to try and come to a final answer. And that's not necessarily the case of what we're trying to achieve with a systematic review in product development and commercial perspectives. And it's more about doing a thorough review in a systematic way. And there's a few other points that we need to think about when we're conducting this review. So it's not just saying what is the scientific validity, but how strong is that scientific validity? And how well does your approach work at doing what you intend to do? So for example, in the case of a detection software, how accurate is that standard way of detecting a particular disease compared to the best practice? As well as thinking about the scientific side, another aim of a literature review is a really good time to think about and unearth potential commercial competitors. So are there any companies that are doing a similar thing or have a similar approach that might be a little bit further ahead or a little bit further behind in their product development? And this is really important. We'll talk about, the reason that's important in terms of demonstrating equivalence when it comes to coming to market, but understanding how well your commercial competitors might be performing helps you understand what performance benchmarks you may want to set for your own software or device. As well as that, you want to think about what the current clinical gold standard is. So what is the way that things are normally done in terms of diagnosis or treatment in this space? And how does your software or device compare to what the current gold standard is? And finally, what are the gaps in the literature? So I know a lot of the audience probably come from an academic background, and if there are gaps in terms of how you want to demonstrate scientific validity, it might point to the need of doing more proof of concept studies, which Hugh mentioned. As well as this, it's important within the systematic review to look out for what are best practices investigation design for your software for its intended use. So keep an eye out for what the best practices are in terms of determining sample size, determining if you need a control or comparator arm, particularly in instances of software devices that have therapeutic intent. And think about how you're going to use validated outcome measures and endpoints, both from a clinical perspective and also a statistical perspective. And we'll go into a little bit of detail about what those examples of what those endpoints might look like. And as I said, again, the gold standard in terms of what the current clinical practice is. So when we're doing a systematic review, it's important to follow best practices. So I'm sure many of you are aware of the PRISMA guidelines in terms of reporting bias and appraising the data in a standard way. And then, of course, you have to go through and give reasons for excluding papers that come through your searches, and set up searches and exclusion criteria that are reasonable. When it comes to commercial literature reviews, the guidance suggests that you should be looking at least 2 databases to avoid bias, and they do have provisions for requiring at least 2 reviewers of papers to, again, avoid bias. So the same standards that are used in academia are adopted in commercial/regulatory space, and that's really important to remember. And I think from a perspective of doing it this way, it's also really important for you repeatability, which we'll come to. So this is an example flowchart of studies via databases and registers from the 2020 guidelines. And it's not in this screenshot, but there's also additional options to say how you could have come across data which didn't come from a systematic search. So there are provisions, for example, of, if you want to take a snowballing approach in addition to systematic searches using, extensive search strings, you should record those pragmatic papers that you find as well. So once you've conducted a systematic review, it's really important to tabulate the findings and write a literature review report. So this is essentially the first step of demonstrating scientific validity. So this is what, a regulator or someone with a commercial interest would look at to see the scientific validity of your approach. So as I said before, it's really important to tabulate all the results and all the papers with reasons for exclusion and inclusion where applicable. For the included papers, extract the data that helps you define the performance benchmarks for what you're trying to achieve, what the current standard of care is, and it's also really important to include any risks identified. So when you do this literature review and you're searching for commercial competitors, it's really important to also search the regulatory, safety, and adverse events databases. And the reason is, and this is often the case in terms of regulatory and commercial submissions, is there's, as Hugh said, it's not just about the benefits, but it's also about the risks and weighing the benefits with the risks. And so it's really important not to be biased in your representation of the data in terms of safety. So that's, again, really important to report when you're writing the results of the literature review. And then in the final section, when you're concluding the literature review, it's really important that you forget that the main point was to demonstrate scientific validity. So the first thing to do is answer the question, is there a scientific association between the claim you're making with your technology and the literature and the clinical output that you're intending to measure, treat, diagnose, predict? What is that association and how strong is that association? What performance metrics are you aiming to prove, and what are the standard performance metrics? And what are the common methodologies used for investigations in this case? And again, in the conclusion, it's important to mention any gaps in the literature which you may intend to fill using a feasibility or proof of concept study. So having done a few of these literature reviews, there are a few tips which I suggest. I think it's really important to ensure consistency. And if you do have a commercial spin out, or you're intending to deploy your technology, it's really important that the search terms and the strategy for searching certain databases are recorded properly, because it may not be you or the same person that's conducting the search a year later. And it's really important in these settings to regularly refresh the searches, because there may be new safety and adverse event data that comes through, and there may also be new ways of performing your technology. So, the clinical standard of care may change, and, the subtleties of your product may change as a result as well. It's really important to maintain a matrix of, possible commercial competitors or equivalent products, not just for the purposes of regulatory and safety, but also for, product strategy. And again, it's really important to document adverse events and think about how that feeds into an update of the risks and benefits of your device. So at minimum, repeating is annually, but oftentimes companies may choose to have a rolling update, so you can set up notifications if any new papers turn up, which might be of interest, or you can also have a shorter interval of 3 to 6 months. It really depends on what the rate of evidence generation is in your space. In some spaces it's very rapid. In other spaces, maybe only a couple of papers will be published every year, and that's fine as long as it's justifiable. That's okay. So those are just general tips about what to think about when you're conducting a literature review. But that's not all. So, not all instances is a literature review enough to demonstrate scientific validity. And that's where early feasibility studies come in. So early feasibility studies forms part of scientific validity. And it's defined in the standards as a very, very early stage investigation in a small sample size to demonstrate that, your technology can perform as it's intended. So for example, in the case of a machine learning development or AI development tool, it may be that you are testing a prototype algorithm on an open source data set just to demonstrate that the approach that you're taking results in appropriate sort of endpoints in terms of the ability to predict a disease or detect a disease, for example. And it's usually on a specific indication, and it's on a small sample size, so it doesn't necessarily need to be statistically powered to demonstrate, a certain effect. That comes later. But this kind of information will be helpful for you in terms of determining what is the effect size you're aiming for, what is the accuracy you're aiming for in terms of delivering a final device. So I assume that there's lots of academics in the room that might be at this stage, and a lot of the research that you may have done in an academic setting would feed into scientific validity. And oftentimes the preliminary research that's been done would be cited within your own literature review, even to say that, these are the early feasibilities that were conducted to demonstrate scientific validity. And in some cases, you might need to do another one to fill in any gaps in the literature. So once we've established that there is a valid clinical association or scientific validity, we move on to determining analytical validity. And I'll focus our conversation in terms of software in particular. And when we talk about analytical validity in software, what we essentially want to say is, are the components of your software working as they are intended to in a controlled setting? So this might involve, if it's a physical device, bench testing, formative usability testing. And, in the case of AI-based tools, you may have a small holdout data set to show that the outputs match what they're intended to match. So Oftentimes, if it's a software-only device, this is where your unit tests of your candidate software happen. So in the previous regulatory seminar, Mike talked through the importance of having a detailed software development plan and having a list of verification and validation tests. So analytical validity is a part of software verification and validation. And so each component of your software will need to be verified in standard unit testing and integration testing protocols. When it comes to formative usability, if your device has a user interface which is either used by a patient or a clinician or a healthcare professional, this is the time to also think about ironing out any issues with user interface and usability in a formative way. So it's a very small sample of a representative set of users to see if there are any issues in terms of how the data is presented or what the journey is of the patient through this software device. And if you have hardware that is integrated within your software, which is becoming increasingly common as hardware becomes the on-ramp for collecting the data, where then we have more powerful analytics being performed, it's really important to also think about the specific standards you need to meet in terms of electrical safety and electromagnetic compatibility and battery safety. For example, if you have a mobile processor that kind of analyzes glucose, for example, this is where you need to think about the hardware components meeting the specifications that you set out based on your intended use. So analytical validity is very much sort of in a controlled environment, seeing that each component of your software works, seeing that in the case of AI, or predicting outputs, it raises errors in the instance where an invalid input is put in. So, if your intended use is specifically for chest X-rays, and determining pathology on a chest X-ray, does your device correctly raise an error or not output a result if an MRI scan is given to it, for example? So once all that testing is done in a controlled setting, that's when we move on to clinical validity, where you determine the candidate device, the candidate product works as intended with a real-world population in a real-world setting. So I'll hand over to Hugh to talk a little bit more about the beginning of how to demonstrate clinical validity, and then I'll come back and talk about examples of clinical investigations.
Thanks, Ankit. I'm going to jump to the chat. We have a question from Lisa Skerry. Should the early feasibility study be an HRA-approved research study? The answer to that is only if you are using real patient data that's not anonymized, that you might need ethical approval for. But as you say, if it's taken from an already HRA approved database, you probably don't need specific further ethical approval for your study, assuming that database has got overarching ethics for multiple studies being run on anonymized data. We will be touching on ethics and the HRA and IRAS process a little later, but I hope that answers your question at this stage. So we'll move on to clinical validity, which is this is the bit that people think about when we talk about clinical evaluation. But as we've demonstrated, there's a whole process to do before you even start doing in-human investigations. And I really want you all to think about this, similar to the drug evaluation process. You don't just develop a compound and immediately test in humans. You do that literature review to demonstrate the scientific validity. You do phase 1, phase 2 studies before you go into your phase 3 and phase 4 studies. So think about this clinical validity stage as more like a phase 3 study where you're actually testing a device on humans. So really think about that. Sorry, there's another question that's come in just before I get into this section from Bala. What are the documents required for applying for an SAMD product with the UK market? This is an extremely broad question, Bala. I would refer you to our regulatory webinar to look at the technical documentation. And if you hold on for the duration of this webinar, we will show you the list of clinical evaluation documentation that you require as well. It's also important to note that at this point, when you're going for clinical validity and you're running a clinical investigation of a medical device, you may need to apply for ethical approval and apply and register that investigation with the MHRA. And the MHRA will only approve that if you can show them you have done the scientific validity and analytical validity steps, and you have a documented software development lifecycle. They do not want people to start testing medical devices that have no scientific validity or technical documentation on human studies, human subjects. So there is a whole bunch of documentation. It will become clearer throughout this webinar, but we're only covering half of the documentation in this webinar on the clinical side. For the technical documentation, you'll have to refer back to the regulatory webinar. So clinical validity, also known as external validation or a pivotal clinical investigation, or the academic term is CIMD, clinical investigation of a medical device. And this is where you use data that is completely independent from your training and validation data that you might have done in your scientific validity or early feasibility studies. It's a clinical investigation must be designed in line with the current gold standards. So those of you in academia will have heard of GCP, which is the Good Clinical Practice framework, which is widely used across the NHS and academia. So anyone who is conducting a pivotal clinical investigation for a medical device should be GCP trained or be taking advice from people who are GCP trained. The GCP framework aligns very neatly with an international standard known as ISO 14155, which we'll mention in a minute. So that these two standards, GCP training and 14155, really guide you on best practice for clinical investigation or design. As I've said, this needs to use independent data and it needs to be representative of your intended population. So you'll remember at the start, we said you need to write down your intended use, and hopefully through doing your intended use exercise and your literature review, you will now have a very good idea of your exact intended population. So all of the limitations, whether that be age range, sex, demographics, any other substratifications that we can think of, you are now going to go out and collect independent data based solely on your intended population. And the whole point of doing this clinical validity phase is to prove every single one of the clinical claims that you're making in your intended use. So a well-designed clinical investigation at this stage can have multiple endpoints. And typically in clinical investigational design, you'll have primary, secondary, maybe even tertiary endpoints that you want to measure. And you need to make sure that you're designing those endpoints to measure those benefits that you've outlined, those clinical claims, and any risks that are associated. So for instance, if you are developing a device that can detect a cardiac arrhythmia based on a wearable device, you will be making claims as to the accuracy of that algorithm, but you must also be measuring the risks. How often does it get it wrong? How often does it confuse one arrhythmia with another? And also look at the risks of using the device. So does an end user understand what to do with that output? Is that clear to the end user, whether that's a patient or a clinician? I'm going to pause now because we've got a couple more questions that have come through. Can we share the link of the regulatory webinar? Yes, Rosie from HDI UK will be sharing all of the links, and all of these videos will be online after the sessions. Another question from Asaf Niaz. Does a software web app recording health and well-being questionnaires such as IPAC or Audit C need to be classed as SAMD? It will depend on your intended use. If you are just recording outputs from a questionnaire, you might not be a medical device, but then that might not be a very useful app if you're just recording outputs. If your app is processing that data and making some kind of clinical decision support or triage, then it would likely be a medical device. So it really depends on what you define as your intended use. Why are you doing those questionnaires? Who are you presenting those outputs to, and for what reason? Those are the questions that will define whether you're an SAMD, a regulated medical device, or not. I hope that answers that question. Lydia, is there a single or standard few sources for searching regulatory and adverse events databases? That's an excellent question. So yes, when you're doing a literature review, you have to pre-specify which databases you're going to search. So typically people might use PubMed, the Cochrane Library, Google Scholar for the kind of academic references. but there are regulatory databases as well. So typically you would look, in America, you look at the FDA MAUDE database, that's MAUDE, which will detail any side effects or adverse events. There is a new European regulatory database called EUDAMED. It is not very well populated yet because it's relatively new, but that should definitely be included in your searches. You can also search the MHRA medical device database. It doesn't have adverse event data, but it will help you identify products that are on market, which may be similar to yours. And you should also do pragmatic searches, as Ankit briefly touched on. So it's perfectly fine to do just normal Google searches for adverse events that might have appeared in the news. For instance, if the Apple Watch has got something wrong and it's made it onto BBC News, you could actually put that into your search and say, look, there are some public reports of adverse events, and that's perfectly acceptable to include. Ideally, if there has been an adverse event reported in news, someone will report it on a regulatory database as well.
Just to add to that, sorry, there is, so on the Gov UK website, there is also field safety notices for drugs and devices. Although it's not very well populated, I think that's also a good place to look for possible adverse events that have happened.
And of course, if you're going to be doing this for your own device, you will have your own post-market feedback mechanisms, which we'll touch on later in the webinar. And you need to include any and all feedback that you receive about your device. And obviously, as a manufacturer, you feel quite possessive and proud of your device. And it can be uncomfortable to be documenting and recording things that people are saying is going wrong with your device, but that is mandatory under the regulatory guidance, and you can be removed from market for falsifying or omitting safety data. So you must be looking at your own feedback mechanisms as well to record safety in adverse events. Another question then from, the chat is moving so fast. Another question from Helena. For AI-based medical devices, can you explain when retrospective or prospective data should be used in a clinical investigation, or should it only be prospective data? We will come on to that, but in essence, in your early feasibility study, it's absolutely fine and probably expected and best practice to use retrospective data. In a clinical investigation, it will depend on your claims. So there's some things you can't prove retrospectively. So if you're claiming a faster turnaround time for clinicians, you can't prove that retrospectively. You have to measure that prospectively, because you can't show that by using your device, a clinician was faster at their job unless you actually measure that. But if your claim is just an accuracy level, then you might be able to use just retrospective data. So it will depend on the claim that you are making. So again, going back to the start of the whole process, it's important to think strategically about your claims, because the more you claim, the more you have to prove. And if you are claiming real world effects, the chances are you will have to get prospective real world evidence. We will touch on this a bit more later in the webinar as well, on the differences between retrospective and prospective data and different investigational designs. Ali has asked, can synthetic data be used for bench tests? Yes, it can be, though you will obviously have to very transparently qualify and quantify the quality of that synthetic data and how relevant it is to your studies. We are seeing this increasingly as a topic, especially where there is data sparsity for certain types of medical products. It's a little bit controversial, and I wouldn't rely on your pivotal clinical investigation relying on synthetic data unless you can prove a very strong association with real world data. I think the attraction of synthetic data is obviously around quantity and the ability to create data that is not linked to real patients. So you bypass any issues of cybersecurity and data protection. But in reality, the only true test of a medical device is going to be in the real world. So ultimately, you will need to use some form of real data. But certainly in the early feasibility phase, you can use synthetic data if you can show that that data is truly representative and has the same biases, substratifications, etc. within it that a real world data set might have. I think that's all the questions for now, but we will keep an eye on the chat as we go along. Could we just go back one slide just to make sure I've covered all the points on that slide? Yes, we have. Brilliant. Let's go on. So many of you will be familiar with this evidence pyramid. So the higher up the pyramid we go, the stronger, more respectable and trustworthy the evidence base is. So obviously we start at the bottom. Editorials and expert opinion don't really prove anything. Often they're conflicted by financial conflicts of interest, and they can be wrong. So we don't tend to include those when we're trying to regulate or prove new medical devices. Going higher up, mechanistic studies, case reports, again, can be biased, especially when looking at sort of single examples. It's very easy to cherry pick data. You might find, a case, let's say you have an X-ray algorithm that found a really rare tumor that all the radiologists missed. That's great, you can report that. But what you haven't done is actually shown all the times where your device got it wrong. So you get a very biased opinion of the performance of the device. So case reports are not necessarily so useful. What we really want to see and what the regulators want to see, and ultimately what your clinical customers will want to see, are the higher degrees of evidence from case control studies, cohort studies, and ultimately randomized controlled trials. For brand new novel devices, it's probably okay to start with case controlled and cohort studies. Randomized controlled trials are a different beast, where you actually will have to run two arms of a study, one with and one without your interventional device. And that can be tricky with software because by the very nature of deploying software into a pathway, you're automatically making changes beyond just the effect or the direct effect of your device. So we haven't seen too many RCTs involving software medical devices yet, though there are several ongoing. And these obviously are in pharma and in the drug world, the only way for drugs to get to market. And at the very top of the pyramid, we have systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So these can only be conducted when multiple RCTs conducted by different investigators have been published. And I don't think the market is mature enough yet to have a look at that, though it will obviously happen in future. So for instance, there are multiple mental health apps delivering digital cognitive behavioral therapy out there. Some of those have been involved in RCTs, some RCTs are ongoing, and I'm sure that meta-analyses may have started to be done, or there might even be some early meta-analyses of RCTs of digital therapy out there, but more will appear. And all of these types of evidence should be considered when you're thinking about your pivotal clinical investigation. But for practical purposes in today's webinar, we will be considering the three that we've pointed to with the arrows here: case control studies, cohort studies, and RCTs. So there is some documentation. So going back to that question about what documentation do you need to present, this is one of them. It's called a CIP, a clinical investigation plan. You might recognize this as a clinical trial protocol. Obviously, as I said at the very start, we don't use the term trial in medical devices, we use investigation. So it's a CIP. But in essence, it is like writing down a formal protocol. You have to build this from your evidence base that you've already gathered. So part of the CIP will be your intended use. Part of it will be the clinical benefits and the associated risks that you're aiming to measure. And part of it will be based on the early feasibility data that you have, and also successful analytical validity outcomes. So you've proven that your device works in practical terms through analytical validity. You've proven that there is a scientific association between what you're claiming and the clinical targets. And you've proven in the literature that there is this association. So now it's time to write down an investigational protocol. And that protocol can take many forms depending on the type of investigation that you choose to do. But in essence, you need to be able to justify the design of that clinical investigation. And we'll talk later on in this webinar about the different types of clinical investigation that can be used. Typical documentation within your CIP will be familiar to academics, such as the investigator's brochure, CRFs, which are case report forms per patient usually, any informed consent procedures, documentation of that consent, and a plan for how to monitor for adverse events and side effects. if we think back to the pharma standard, they actually also have documentation and processes for when they might stop a clinical trial of a new drug. If there's too many toxicity reports or too many grade 3 or grade 4 side effects, you should also have a similar plan for, do we stop the clinical investigation of the medical device? Is it getting it wrong too often? Is it dangerous? So we stop and go back to the drawing board. So those are the kind of documents you need in your CIP. So moving on. Oh yeah, I should also mention that you can have multiple CIPs. So if your device is making multiple claims and it's not practical or possible to measure them in one clinical investigation, you can run parallel or multiple clinical investigations. So you can have multiple CIPs. Typically, you will need to partner with some kind of clinical site or partner site. So if your device is aimed at secondary care, this might be a hospital. If it's aimed at primary care, it might be a series of GP practices. If it's directly aimed at patients, then you might want to invite patient and user groups. You need to have formal agreements with all of these partner sites. And you need to really well document who's in charge. You need to document exactly what clinical data points you are and aren't collecting, what data you are storing, how long for, what the data destruction processes are, the anonymization protocols, and who is responsible for risk management. And those of you who are GCP trained will be familiar with all of this terminology. This is also outlined in the ISO standard 14155 that I mentioned. For higher risk investigations, it's common good practice to establish a data monitoring committee. So if you are collecting real world data on real patients, whether it's anonymized or not, it's important to consider whether you need a data monitoring committee. And if you are collecting real world data on real patients and you are intending to affect real world patient care through any mechanism of intervention, you will likely need ethical approval. And this is done in the UK through the IRAS platform, which is run by the HRA. And then, which we will explain in a little while, you will need an exemption from the MHRA. So you need to write to the MHRA and say, we would like to conduct a pivotal clinical investigation of a non-UKCA or CE marked medical device. Can we have approval? And they will ask to see your CIP, your intended use, your literature review, your feasibility study data, and your analytical validity data. So you will need that documentation in order just to get a clinical investigation off the ground. As independent external consultants, we see a lot of startups and spin-outs jumping straight to this clinical investigation phase without having done steps 1 to 3 already. And they have to go back and start to do all this documentation again because the MHRA or the ethics committee reject their request to run their clinical investigation because they haven't done any of this stuff. So I'm hoping that we are highlighting the importance of it, but also explaining why it's necessary and indeed useful for best practice clinical investigation designs. So that's the CIP in a nutshell. We'll talk a little bit more about how it all fits into the process in a little while. Here's the standard that I mentioned, ISO 14155. You have to purchase this standard. It costs £289 off the BSI website. And auditors will check. If you claim that you are doing something to a standard, the auditor will go, brilliant, where's your copy of the standard? So I know that you've read it. So obviously, if you're a startup, this is a tax deductible expense. And actually do read it. If you're taking clinical investigation seriously, read it. You can also do GCP courses. There's many institutes that will train you in GCP. And typically this might be your chief clinical officer, your chief safety officer, or your chief medical officer in your business or company. Or hire someone externally who is experienced in designing studies and can work within this GCP framework. You are very unlikely to get ethical approval unless you have someone who is demonstrably trained in GCP. As we mentioned, you will need ethics approval. These are the acronyms that you'll need to know. IRAS is the portal. It's a web portal for which you can submit research applications. And this is used by the entirety of the UK for any and all study, whether it's a medical device or a drug or any intervention or or study that anyone is doing in healthcare, and it's governed by the NHS body, Health Research Authority, or the HRA. And they are the ones who will set up a ethics committee, which will review your application and give you a thumbs up to proceed or not. There can be fees associated with this, and there is a time delay as well. So always inquire early. You can always put in sort of early trial design, investigation design, and get feedback as well. And you should be working with someone who's GCP trained to make sure that investigational design meets all of the standards, because if it doesn't, the HRA will only come back and say you haven't met the standards. So you can try and avoid that, that feedback loop. They will appoint a research ethics, if we go back one slide, sorry, they will appoint a research ethics committee known as a REC. There are many different RECs around the country, different NHS trusts or consortium of trusts have RECs, and RECs can be specialists in different clinical areas. So you might have a REC for cancer, you might have a REC for cardiology, and you can even have subspeciality RECs. So there might be an AI REC for your particular clinical condition. So the HRA can point you to the relevant research ethics committee as well. And then you will also need to apply to, or you may need to apply to the regulators in whichever jurisdiction you are conducting your clinical investigation, to notify them about your intent to conduct a clinical investigation for a medical device. So this again has a process which is done through an online IRAS portal. You also need to submit all of your documentation, including some of the technical documentation that was covered in our regulatory webinar. So the MHRA will not approve an investigational device exemption unless they can see that you have done your software development lifecycle documentation to the right standards. There are fees. The MHRA have upped their fees this year. It can be a few £1,000s for each device. In the USA, you will also need to do this through the FDA IDE process as well. Once you are approved, you can then conduct your investigation. You will need to register your clinical investigation protocol on an appropriate registry. Gov.uk has one, and then there is a clinicaltrials.gov as well that you'll need to register on. And once you're registered, you will also need to submit quarterly summary reports. And there is now a new mandate for AI-driven devices that you must publish your results. What they don't like is that people conduct clinical investigations and then they never publish. That might be because the results were bad, or the trial or investigation was stopped early, but you should still publish, because this adds to the public understanding and knowledge and advances science further. Science is a series of experimentation, and not all experiments work. And it's important to learn from when it doesn't work. So please do publish your results. I'm going to go to the questions very quickly. Someone has pointed a site called evs.ee. Standards are less expensive to buy there. I don't know that website. I can't verify that information, but thank you for pointing that out. Barla says, can an SAMD device be class 1? Yes. It's rare, but a software as a medical device can be class 1. Is self-certification possible for that? Yes, as long as it's not class 1M, which is a measurement device. And does a class 1 device which just optimizes workflow and doesn't involve clinical decision need to do a clinical study? Technically, if you are a class 1 device, you are self-certifying that you have done the relevant clinical investigations. No one will audit you, though the regulators can knock on your door at any date and ask you to present them with your documentation. So it is inadvisable not to do all the right paperwork, because the regulators can. I used to work at a company which had a class 1 software device, and the regulators did knock on the door and said, can we see your technical and clinical file? And we did not have one, and we got in trouble. So you can get in trouble from the regulators. So I do not advise you not to do it just because you're a class 1 device. Do not see class 1 as the easy way out. There is still work to be done. Ashley Miles says, how do we keep IP secure if we need to publish? That is a very good question. You don't necessarily need to publish your secret source. I don't think publishing your results necessarily betrays any intellectual property that you have. Let's say you have developed an IP patented algorithm that detects something in blood plasma, you do not need to publish the details of that algorithm, but you should be publishing how accurate that algorithm is. I think that's only fair if you want to be able to sell your device on market. And I hope that answers that question. Going back to the slides, these are the fees for clinical investigations for devices. It will depend on the class of device. I'm not going to touch on regulatory classes. Those were covered in the regulatory system, but just to say that class 1 is the lowest risk and class 3 is the highest risk. And obviously the higher the risk, the tougher it is to get regulatory approval, and the more beefy your clinical investigation will need to be. Especially if your device has an implantable aspect, like a cardiac defibrillator run by AI software, for instance. So that the fees are more for those. So those are the amounts of fees that you need to be aware of, especially for those of you going for external investment. Do include a budget for fees for clinical investigational submissions. This table, sorry, the writing is a little bit small, but we will be showing the slides afterwards. But there is a kind of pathway that the MHRA has published of whether you need MHRA notification or not. In essence, you probably will if you are conducting the study on real world evidence and you're going for UKCA or CE marking. We'll take a pause very briefly there because we're about to get into the meat of investigational design, which is the thing where people think about when they think about clinical evaluation. I'm going to hand over to Anki for this. I expect this is the part where people will have the most questions. So we will open up for people to put their hands up and verbally ask questions rather than type them in if they choose, to talk about investigational design. But we've done 1 hour and 10. Anki, do you think that's a good point where we have a short break before we get into this part?
Yeah, I think so. We should have a 10-minute break. Or...
So if it's okay with the audience, we will come back at 20 past 10. So that'll give us 10 minutes to take a break, and then we'll get into the meat of investigational design. Be prepared to ask questions, and I hope you are finding this session useful so far. We'll see you in 10 minutes.
Just give everyone one more minute. Are you happy for me to start, Rosie?
Yeah, go ahead, thanks.
Great. Hi, everyone. Hope you had a good break. So for the next part, we'll talk about the details about investigation design. Obviously, the limits are, we can't go into too much detail because, as the first point says, it highly depends on the claims being made in the intended use. And then
you need to get your slides at full screen. Yeah. I'm presenting to you at the moment.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Thanks. And then we'll talk about data collection in terms of post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up, and the benefits and limitations of real-world evidence collection. So there's been a few questions in the chat about, whether we need retrospective and prospective data and what the exact designs of studies should be. And it highly depends on what the intended use of your product is and what claim you want to substantiate. So if you are claiming to be better than the current standard of care, or whether you want to claim to be a clinical decision support software, the level of that claim would be different. And so you'd need to have a different level of evidence to substantiate that. Often in cases which involve therapeutic interventions or recommendations, such as digital therapeutics, you'd often need a comparator arm to show that your digital therapeutic or intervention is non-inferior to or superior to the current standard of care, or a placebo arm, for example. And because of that, it's likely needed to be prospective with blinding and randomization, depending on what the current standards are, as you've unearthed in your literature review. And if that's the case, and it's for an investigational device or investigational software which you intend to market as a medical device, then all the things we just discussed about needing HRA research ethics approval and MHRA investigational device exemptions all apply. In some instances, if you're just making the claim of measuring something or improving the accuracy of performing a certain task, then as long as you can demonstrate that your ground truth is adequately labeled by an adequately qualified person, and the data that you are validating on has been appropriate, the data has appropriate consent for it to be used in these kinds of instances, then a retrospective study may be suitable. There are some special cases, particularly for software, especially as we venture into AI-based tools which are intended to improve the way a user works. So in that case, we'll go into the details of how you demonstrate that an AI-assisted user performs better than an unassisted user. And for that, you might need crossover design studies, multi-reader, multi-case studies, or case control studies. But it all really depends on what you want to claim to be able to do. And we briefly touched on this at the beginning of the talk, but it's really important to define what outcomes you want to measure your performance by. And these need to be aligned with the intended clinical benefits that you articulated at the very first stage. Outcome measures, as Hugh briefly touched on, should be validated and commonly accepted clinical outcomes. And equally, we need to think about using gold standard statistical metrics. And we'll talk a little bit about what, preferable statistical metrics may be from a clinical and a regulatory perspective compared to what might be commonly used in an academic AI lab perspective. As Hugh said, it's really important, if you are going to, make your own measure, then that's something that you would need to validate separate to the effectiveness of your device. So you'd first need, if you are going to use a new measure, for example, to determine the intensity of a disease or the the prognostication of a disease, then you would need to prove that there is a valid clinical association between your measurement and the clinical output, separate to your device being able to perform that measurement. So that's why the literature review is really important in making sure you understand what the outcomes should be. So we'll just go through a few examples across the software as a medical device range of tools that are out there. This is a non-exhaustive list, and it's just a very broad overview, so it may not apply to some of the ideas that might be being developed with the audience. But we'll start with digital therapeutics, so mental health digital therapeutics or any other kind of digital therapeutics for other diseases are becoming increasingly common. And the clinical measure depends on the intended claim you make, but if your intent is to treat, then you should be using a pre-validated psychometric score, for example, to show that there is a significant effect size pre and post treatment. So that effect size may be measured using the Cohen's d, which tends to be the most common. And oftentimes in this prospective double-arm trial, you'd have to compare to a reasonably justified comparator arm. So in the case of digital therapeutics, are you going to be using a waitlist control or some sort of placebo control? Sometimes it can be quite difficult, and there's advantages and disadvantages to each, and also cost implications for each. And as long as you can justify that that design helps you meet the intended claims that you made in the first stage, then that should be suitable. As a second example, let's say you're using a piece of software that helps in a quote unquote track and trace kind of scenario where you're trying to reduce the spread of communicable disease, whether it's viral, bacterial, for example, in a population or in a hospital. The clinical measure would be how you measure the ground truth. So is it going to be a blood test or a PCR test to test for the presence of a disease? And then your statistical measure may be the incident rate ratio or the incident rate difference pre and post intervention of this track and trace app. So that would be an interrupted time series design where you measure the rate of infection before the intervention and after, and you determine whether the intervention has a significant improvement in the incidence rate. And we'll talk a little bit more about biological ground truth for radiology AI, actually. So the most common AI applications for the last few years have been in the radiology space. And again, the study design within a radiology AI tool, or for that matter, any sort of diagnostic or detection tool, depends on the claim being made. So the clinical measure, it should say with biological ground truth, but the clinical measure is the presence or an absence of a particular pathology with an appropriate ground truth. So, for example, if it is going to be an AI tool that helps to diagnose cancer, your biological ground truth would likely need to be histological data to show that what you're seeing on the scan and inferring to be cancer is actually cancer. In cases where the diagnosis is completely radiological, that may not be needed. So for example, pneumothorax for the clinical audience may not need a biological ground truth. And the statistical measures should be based on the current gold standards. So oftentimes this is sensitivity, specificity, and the area under the curve. So these are instances where if you're simply claiming, for example, to notify a clinician that there is a abnormality on a scan, then your performance metrics might just be standalone performance of the AI in detecting pathology. But if your claim is by, for example, overlaying contours or pointing to a region of interest, your claim may be that you're improving a radiologist's ability to detect a disease with the assistance of an AI. And if you're doing that, then you'd need to prove that the AI-assisted radiologist or healthcare professional performs better than a standalone radiologist or healthcare professional. And for that, you need what's called a multi-reader, multi-case study design. And so this kind of study design applies not just in radiology, but in any instance where you're claiming improvement in AI-assisted healthcare professional performance. So in this design, traditionally, you'd have 2 arms in a crossover design. So you'd have group 1 of healthcare professionals reading a set of scans with AI assistance, having a 4-week washout period, and then reading the same scans without AI assistance. And at the same time, you'd have an inverted group of people who do the standard, like without AI assistance first, and then with AI assistance. And then the intended measure would be, is there an improvement in the receiver operating curve on average across the number of radiologists? We're seeing increasingly more clients coming to Hardian with next generation sequencing tools, with the idea of using personalized medicine applications for example, pharmacogenomics and individual therapy selection. And this becomes quite tricky in a personalized medicine setting because it often needs to be suboptimal retrospective data. So for example, you might look at, if you're trying to reduce cardiovascular risk on an individual level, you might look at things like progression-free, reduction of improvement in chemotherapy for cancer. You might be looking at progression-free survival. For cardiovascular disease, you might look at specific inflammatory or cardiovascular markers which are established to be associated with that cardiovascular disease. Or again, in the therapeutics space, you might be looking at specific measures of treatment response. And that might include quality of life metrics as well, or composite outcome measures, but oftentimes they are clinical. And then the statistical measure would be the effect size between the personalized arm or the non-personalized arm. And within that, it's good practice to think about subgroup analysis to show that, you know, certain individuals or certain subpopulations aren't that all subpopulations are receiving the same intended benefit that you claim in the first step. So those are the main points about thinking about investigational design. And once you've done the investigation, it's really important to think about how you're going to document all the findings, including the risks and benefits. So Hugh talked about writing a clinical investigation plan, which says everything you're going to do. And this is the sort of complementary document, which comes afterwards, where you report all the results in an auditable and traceable way. And you also document any adverse events. This is especially important in terms of regulatory submission, because regulators care about safety and risk as much as performance, because it's all about demonstrating that the benefits outweigh the risks, particularly for novel devices. And for example, if there are some shortcomings that you came across in your clinical investigation of your device, which show that it's safe, but it perhaps, you know, the effectiveness may not have been as intended, but you still demonstrated some effect size, you should give an indication of what other extra data you would collect in a post-market setting to substantiate any further claims, or any extra claims you may want to make on top of what claims you've already proven. And that takes us on to the post-market setting, with the obvious distinction that a post-market follow-up and post-market surveillance requires the device to then have gained regulatory approval. So at this point, you'd think about submission to a regulator if you are a Class 2A device or above, for a CE or UKCA mark. We'll talk about post-market data first, and then we'll come back to the clinical evaluation report, which is the fundamental and final clinical evaluation document, which needs to be updated. And then we'll move on to more broader considerations of how clinical evaluation fits into value propositions and delivery. So I'll hand over to Hugh for post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up.
Brilliant, thanks, Enki. So we're now at step 5, and those of you who have been following along will know that we're not at the end of the journey yet. So if you've been doing these processes properly and documenting them as you go along, getting your intended use, your literature review, your scientific validity, analytical validity, and now you've proven clinical validity, That, as Ankit says, is when you might submit for regulatory approval. But you are a medical device manufacturer. You are mandated by law to monitor the performance and safety of your device forever while it is on market. And these documents must be continually updated through the practices of post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up. You will be audited on an annual basis at minimum, and you can have random unannounced audits from your regulatory auditors as well. So it's super important to factor in all the elements of post-market clinical evaluation when you're thinking about bringing a medical device to market. So what does post-market surveillance and clinical follow-up actually mean in practical terms? We'll go to the next slide, please. So you have to produce two documents. One is your PMS, your post-market surveillance plan, and one is your PMCF, which is your post-market clinical follow-up plan. These are documents that include proactive and reactive parts to collecting post-market data. Your PMS plan should relate to all non-clinical outcomes, essentially. So it's feedback from users, whether they be a patient or a clinician using your device. There should be surveillance for complaints, either via email or social media or in the news. You should be surveilling for adverse events, and there are two types of adverse events. You have AEs, which are the standard adverse events, and then you have serious adverse events, which are SAEs. In your documentation, you should have identified in advance what you would consider to be a serious adverse event, but in broad strokes, it's when a patient comes to harm or potentially even death, even though that is relatively unlikely using software. And obviously, if you are receiving too many reports of serious adverse events, you have a duty, obviously, to take your device off market until it can be adjusted and proven safe. And you need to do this in a proactive and a reactive way. So proactive means you have to set up and demonstrate to regulators that you have a system in place, that you have validated, that you can receive these complaints, you can monitor, and you are monitoring for adverse events. And then reactive is you have to have standard operating procedures documented for how you will respond to these reports. So that's the post-market surveillance. So think about it as setting up a system by which you will, for perpetuity, monitor the safety and performance of your device. A post-market clinical follow-up plan is a sort of a subset, really, of post-market surveillance. And this is just focused on your clinical performance. So this is a proactive plan to say what you are going to measure in terms of clinical performance ongoing using real-world data. And this can be tricky because often, if let's say you're deploying software into a hospital, you have to set up data sharing agreements whereby you are able to collect the performance data. Let's say you have an algorithm which is, I don't know, triaging users in A&E, whether they need to see a junior or a senior or have a blood test, for instance, and your output of your device is directing the patient flow through A&E. That would be a medical device. But you want to monitor that up, follow that up clinically using your PMCF, that you will need to be getting feedback from the A&E department on how often you are getting it right. Now, you don't need to monitor every single time your device emits an output, but you should have a plan to collate data on a statistically representative sample of that data so that you can show that it is performing safely in that statistically representative sample. And this is especially important for AI-driven devices where there's a concept known as performance drift. So what that means is that your algorithm, once it's approved on market, is sort of set in stone. You can't edit or change it without going through repeat audits. So your algorithm is fixed, but the data environment in which it sits may change. So, you know, the hospital may change their CT scanner or upgrade their ECG machine. And if your device is taking input from those devices, then they can drift away and the performance can change. So you need to be able to monitor for drift proactively. It's also well known, especially for AI-driven devices, that devices do not work off the shelf as well at different sites. Sometimes you have to go to a site and retune or retrain. So that's allowable under the medical device regulations. It's a myth that you can't. You absolutely can. It comes into your post-market clinical follow-up, whereby you can monitor and deploy in a hospital setting, for instance, measure the performance, and then come back and within standard operating procedures, have a predetermined methodology for fine-tuning your algorithm to work in that hospital. As long as, and this is the super important caveat, your intended use stays the same. You can't change the intended use, but you can say, look, we're going to tweak the algorithm, maybe adjust the operating threshold of an AI algorithm for this particular hospital site, having retrained on some data there. And that is perfectly allowable as long as you are documenting it and obviously following it up to show that your change, your retuning or retraining of your algorithm has actually made your algorithm perform at the operating threshold and performance levels that you demonstrated pre-market. Obviously, your customers as hospital or clinicians, they will want to know, is the device working as intended and as promised in your sales and marketing? So they will be demanding this data as well. There's huge interest in understanding how radiology AI systems work currently and across other medical specialties as well. So you need to be thinking about how are we going to collect that data? How are we going to measure variability across sites? How are we going to check performance is maintained? And also have a plan for what happens when there is performance drift. It is not inconceivable that you deploy into a hospital and then 5 years later, they change their IT systems and your device just simply does not work anymore. That is a risk of being in the software as a medical device industry. And you need to have plans to help mitigate and combat and be ready for those. I'm going to pause because I think there's a couple of questions here. So we're just going to have a look. Magdalena has said, in the case of a device which is left implanted post-study, how does the transfer of study follow-up of serious adverse events proceed to post-investigation safety oversight by the manufacturers? I am assuming the study follow-up of serious adverse events ends with the end of the investigation. What happens with any events ongoing at the end of the study that the manufacturer continues the oversight? That's a really good question, quite a niche specialty case, but in essence, you would have to put it in your post-market clinical follow-up for ongoing monitoring. So let's say you've implanted a device for the purposes of a clinical investigation, you've got regulatory approval, those devices remain implanted in patients. You absolutely, by law, have to follow those patients up ongoing for the lifetime of that device until they may be removed or the patient dies, I would assume. So you would have to build that into your post-market clinical follow-up and have clear processes of what to do in the case of serious adverse events. If it turns out that your device is actually dangerous and after 3 years they all fail, then you will have to take it off market. And that is just a risk of being in the medical device market. Second question, Helena has asked, what's the suitable lifetime for a software as a medical device, including AI, and how is it best to determine it? Really good question. And I think it's almost too early to know, really, and it will depend on several factors. Obviously, the IT environment in which you deploy. The lifetime of your device is really only going to be suitable for the lifetime of that IT environment. And as long as performance does not drift too far away from the baseline performance that you are claiming as demonstrated by your pivotal investigation. So the best way to determine it would probably be to include in your documentation annual review at a minimum, to ask yourselves the question, is it time to update or remove this version of the device from market and get a repeat regulatory submission for an improved version of our algorithm or product. So there is no strict set in stone lifetime of a medical device, though the only caveat to that is the lifetime of a device is defined as the lifetime of which it is on market. And you are on market as long as your device is available to be used in the clinical setting of which it's intended. Whether you're selling it or giving it away for free, it is still on market. So the lifetime of the device is while it is on market. And that's a bit of a how long is a piece of string question. It's as long as it is demonstrated to be safe and performant as per your intended claims. Real world evidence. This is a term that we see bandied around a lot, RWE, and real world evidence relies on RWD, which is real world data. And what do we mean by that? We mean actually collecting data being used on real patients in real time. real world evidence is really hard to prove in a retrospective fashion, because you are taking the data essentially out of its clinical context. Often you're cleaning that data to remove any corrupted inputs. Well, we all know in the real world, corrupted inputs are everywhere. Your CT scanner could glitch out, your ECG lead could drop off halfway through a trace, your wearable could become loose on someone's wrist. So there's all sorts of reasons to collect real world evidence, because the real world is messy, much messier than collated data sets. And so it is seen as the gold standard. And ideally, if you've done your clinical investigation appropriately, you will have used real world evidence in that, but you absolutely should be using real world evidence in your post-market clinical follow-up studies. And it can often be more useful in providing information about how effective your solution is. And it can be cheaper than a randomized control investigation as well, because you don't necessarily have to have a comparator arm. You're just testing the device in situ in patients without a case control or cohort arm within a study design. But of course, all clinical investigation designs, including real world evidence, can have limitations. Often you can have insufficient data because you're limited by the nature of the cohort of which your device is being used on. And when you start out and you're first on market, that cohort might be relatively small. And as of yet, there are not really any established standards for exactly how real-world data should be done in best practice. Though we do look to standards like ISO 14155 and GCP to inform that. There's no official sort of standard at the moment. Real-world evidence is used in the post-market surveillance paradigm, and it's especially useful to help provide evidence for those reimbursement conversations that ultimately you will have. And this is where we lean into the other part of clinical investigation design, which is thinking about the health economic considerations. So far, we've just talked about the clinical things that you're going to measure, but a really good design study will be based on real-world evidence and will not only just measure clinical performance and safety, but will also measure health economic outcomes. For instance, if you want to claim that your device is cost-effective for a clinical service to use, you should be measuring both the current cost of the standard of care and the cost of using your medical device in that care pathway. And hopefully you can demonstrate a cost saving. And that might be an immediate cost saving because it's cheaper than standard of care, or it might be a delayed cost saving because downstream quality of life and outcomes improve. So for instance, if you're detecting cancer earlier, you might be able to measure a cost effect 20 years later because people are surviving cancer longer because it was diagnosed earlier. So think about collecting that health economic data as well, and that counts as real world evidence as well. And it's important to note this is encouraged currently by the FDA explicitly. It's not a term that is included in the medical device regulations, though obviously it is implied. And Germany has a nascent framework for real world evidence through their DIGA program, which is for software medical devices as well. Next slide, please. So let's put it all together. I'm going back to the earlier question of what documentation do you need to show. So the acronyms in purple is the list of clinical documentation that you need to demonstrate. So you need an IUS, which is the intended use statement, and a clinical evaluation plan, which includes literature review, a CIP, a CIR, PMS, PMCF, and all of that comes into the clinical evaluation report. So you can think about documents having complementary documents. So the intended use is standalone and governs everything downstream. The CEP, the complementary document, is the CER. So you made a plan, then you produce a report. The CIP is complemented by the CIR. So the plan is then complemented by a report. And then the PMS and PMCF come after those and feed back into your CER. So your CER is essentially a living document that will continually grow. So let's talk about in practical terms. As a medical device manufacturer, you will produce a version of your CER to submit for your regulatory submission, for your first one, for your audit, where you'll get your UKCA or CE mark. But then as you do post-market clinical follow-up and PMS and your annual literature review updates, you will add to the CER. If you are doing specific PMCF studies to broaden your claims, you might add in more CIPs, more clinical investigation plans, and CIRs. So the document, the CER, will grow. And as you get repeat audited or have random unannounced audits from the regulators, part of the documentation they will ask to see is your CER. The CER is mandatory to maintain, and it is important that it has input not only from the clinical people within your team and business, but also from the regulatory team. And it needs to have executive sign-off from within your company. We've seen people fail audits simply because they did not have management reviews from the C-suite in their company to ensure that things like the CER and quality management systems were maintained and up to date. So it's important to get everyone involved. You are now a medical device manufacturer. You are now providing software to clinical care, and you are affecting, hopefully, positively, patient care. And you have a legal, ethical and moral duty to make sure that that is ongoing for the lifetime of the device. You may choose to publish parts of your CER. So you might, when you write a clinical investigation report, you might choose to publish that in a paper. That's absolutely acceptable. You might choose to publish your PMCF. You may even choose to publish your literature review just to share knowledge. Though none of these are mandatory, but you may well want to consider them. So hopefully that gives you an overview of all of the documentation. And now you've got some understanding of the acronyms and terms used. And you should have a skeleton framework now in your mind of all the documentation that you will need to produce and maintain. So we're going to move now on to step 6, which is delivering value. And we're going to reference this in particular to the new NICE evidence standards framework, herein referred to as the ESF. So for those of you who don't know, NICE is sort of an arm's length government body in the UK, the National Institute for Healthcare Excellence. I can't remember the acronym exactly, but NICE is the non-regulatory body for all clinical drugs, devices in healthcare. And obviously, software as a medical device is a new subset of that. And they've produced this new evidence standards framework for software-based medical devices. And I was one of many experts on a panel advising on the production of this framework. And it's really pleasing to see that they've aligned it very well with the regulatory criteria. And I'll explain exactly what that means in the following slides. So part of the ESF is obviously clinical evidence, but they also want you to go further and show health economic evidence, value, and alignment with the basic ethical principles of the entire framework. And we'll show you what all of the standards are and what kind of devices they relate to. But first, what do we mean by delivering value? Obviously, you have clinical value, so you have a clinical benefit. Hopefully, you've now proven that in your studies and will keep proving that in your post-market clinical follow-up. But you must also deliver financial value. You don't necessarily have to be cheaper. You can be more expensive. There are drugs that come to market that cost £500,000 a dose, but but they're used in third-line cancer treatments. You can be more expensive as long as you are showing that there is a downstream cost saving somewhere and a massive clinical benefit. So it's false to think that you necessarily need to be cheaper. And the way that you demonstrate that you can deliver a financial benefit is through health economic modeling. And those of you who came to our seminar recently, we did talk about all the different types of modeling. And I'm not going to go into them in detail here, but essentially you need to show that the outcome divided by the cost is demonstrating some kind of value, and that you are affordable. Your pricing is balanced compared to that value within the total budget of NHS care that's available, either nationally or within a given trust or practice. Or if you're direct to consumer, that consumers find it affordable as well. And clinical outcomes do feed into economic models. When we're doing economic modeling, there's assumptions made within models that you are hitting a certain level of clinical performance. So for instance, if you're saying you are 95% accurate, that has a different economic value than if you are 100% accurate. So when you're designing clinical investigations, it's always a good idea to have a chat with health economists to make sure that you are collecting the value-based data related to this performance. And selecting those outcomes, whether they're primary, secondary, or tertiary, can really be important and matter a lot. And it has also to be aligned to your intended use and your benefits, because you will, when making clinical claims, you will be saying we are addressing things in a care pathway. And economic models are built on care pathway design. They have decision trees, then have Markov modeling with time loop series within them. And you have to be able to model that care pathway of which you are claiming to have a direct clinical benefit in your intended use. So it all comes together, which is why we're including it in this clinical evaluation webinar, because it would be a mistake to forget about it and think health economics can be done post hoc, when really best practice, it should be done in combination with your clinical investigation design. So let's have a look at the standards framework. NICE produced this to encourage consistency across the NHS, not just for software as a medical device, but for all digital health technologies. So not everything digital is a medical device. There are operational things, there are health and well-being apps, which are not regulated medical device. So digital health technologies, or DHTs, are a broader set of technologies than just software as a medical device. And the framework is quite comprehensive in that it covers not only the clinical performance relevant to your intended use, but also the evidence of economic impact and financial risk. And it was updated at mid last year to include other things like design factors and deployment considerations, the ethics, and indeed the carbon neutrality of devices. And it should provide evidence to help with the reimbursement or commissioning or purchasing decisions across the NHS. So it really is a really good framework to look at early, pre-clinical investigation design, hopefully, so to make sure that you're going to be ticking all those standards boxes. And why are we mentioning NICE at all? Well, ultimately, as a manufacturer of a medical device, you would like it to be used as widely as possible across the NHS. And to do that, you may well require a NICE health technology assessment at some point, and they will rely on the NICE evidence standards framework to inform that technology assessment. So it's an excellent framework to be considering from the early stage. So what does the framework look like? We'll move to the next slide. They've subcategorized their standards. There are 21 standards for class 2, for tier C medical devices, as they call them. And these are the standards. There's 5 of them: design factors, describing value, demonstrating performance, delivering value, and performance considerations. And so you can see that clinical evaluation doesn't just come under demonstrating performance. It comes into the describing and delivering value as well, and the performance considerations. And obviously your design factors should prove that you have designed your device to be able to deliver those value adds and that performance level that you're claiming. So it really will help companies in their evidence generation building. It will help evaluators like NICE and purchasers make their decisions in an informed manner, and hopefully enable access for patients and end users. Now, patients themselves, they won't know about this framework, or the typical layperson won't, at least, but your clinician end users may be aware of it and may be asking questions of you according to this framework. And it answers just the main question: what evidence should be shown to facilitate commissioning or purchasing decisions for DHTs in the NHS? And it is aligned with the medical device regulations. So as I mentioned, tier C technologies in the NICE ESF are medical devices. So these are class 2 and above software as a medical device, and that includes AI devices, because as per your intended use, they are intended to either inform clinical management, drive clinical management, treat or diagnose a specific condition. And so we're going to focus mainly on tier C devices, because that is the majority of what software as a medical device is. Class 1 devices might be something that communicate about healthcare, or act like a diary, or storage of information, or promote good health, but they aren't diagnosing, treating, informing, or driving the management of a disease. And tier A devices are the non-medical devices. So these are things that might run in the background. So your booking systems, for instance, or patient communication portals. They aren't medical devices, but they are a digital health technology. So tier C is the one we're going to focus on, which includes software as a medical device. As I said, they're not a regulator, they're a national evaluator, but that doesn't mean that they ignore the medical device regulations. As I've said, they align with the medical device regulations. And if you meet the evidence standards framework, it does not mean that you've got regulatory approval. In fact, you cannot get a NICE health technology assessment or a thumbs up from NICE without being regulatory approved. That is one of the criteria for undergoing a NICE health technology assessment. But they have aligned it to regulatory processes wherever possible. And also, if you fulfill the evidence standards framework, it doesn't mean you have been assessed by NICE or endorsed or approved. To do that, you have to do a formal health technology assessment. So you can sign up to the innovation service through this link, which notifies NICE that your technology exists. And then once you are in their sort of system, you then might want to apply for an HTA assessment at some point. Next slide, please. So how do we map the standards to software as a medical device development? So there are 21 standards for TSC devices. The first 10 focus around your conceptualization and design, and that includes your intended use that we've spoken about. And in fact, intended use is mentioned explicitly in one of those standards. There's then a second part, which kind of loops back into conceptualization and design, which is your clinical evidence review and the clinical pathways of which you fit. So you have to define the pathway and actually write down what the pathway is with and without your device, and all the evidence that you have planned and looked at in your literature review and your feasibility. Standards 5, 4, and 15 talk about performance and real-world evidence, as we mentioned. So performance can be in your pivotal clinical investigation, but also in your post-market clinical follow-up, which is covered by evidence standards 16 and partly in evidence standard 15, which is your ongoing surveillance. And then there are 2 standards relating to delivering value, which are explicitly called out. And we discussed those in our health economic webinar, which we conducted and will be available via video via the HDRU website after the course. So let's have a look at all of the standards together. A bit of a complex slide, but what I want you to focus on is 2 things. One, it's split into those 5 categories, which are the purple headers. It's also split by columns into the tier of device. And remember that software as a medical device is in tier C. So all 21 standards apply to software as a medical device. In bold are the ones that we're explicitly going to focus on for this webinar. So if we look at standard 10, you'll see the phrase intended purpose. So that is completely compatible with intended use. And obviously part of the intended use is to define your target intended population, which we discussed at the start of this webinar. Standards 14, 15, and 16 is all about performance. And they are really in line with what we've discussed in terms of clinical investigation, which is evidence to support your claimed benefits. So that's standard 14. Real world evidence to show that they're actually claimed in practice. So showing that actually when you put the device in the hands of your intended users, that those benefits are being realized. And again, you can do that pre-market in your clinical investigation, or you can do it post-market in your post-market clinical follow-up. And then 16, recognizing that software doesn't maintain its performance over time because of performance drift and the changing IT environment, or indeed the changing health environment. For instance, COVID came along and suddenly many chest X-ray devices may have been out of date, for instance, because it was a new disease that appeared globally. So you should agree a plan for measuring those changes over time, and that aligns with your post-market clinical follow-up plans. So it does fit very nicely and dovetail with the medical device regulations. And I'll briefly touch on standards 17 and 18. It is recommended that you show value through budget impact modeling, or if you are a higher financial risk device, a cost effectiveness analysis. And again, I'll refer you back to our health economic webinar to go into those a bit more detail. So we'll go to the next slide. So let's dive into some of those standards that we highlighted in a bit more detail. So standard 10, again, going back to the intended purpose. You will obviously not be able to bring a medical device to market unless you can say who your medical device is intended for and exactly which population. And that applies for any type of digital health technology. But let's look at TSC explicitly. You will have defined your target population very clearly, the exact age range, the exact gender, the exact demographics, and any inclusion and exclusion criteria that might apply. So your device, let's say, is an app that is giving digital cognitive behavioral therapy. You might exclude people who are already demonstrating suicidal ideation, for instance. You might not think it's appropriate to provide your services to them. So you have to be able to show that you are actively able to exclude those patients and safeguard them to an appropriate care pathway where they can be dealt with, rather than putting your device on the market and just allowing anyone and everyone to use your device. You should be able to describe the expected uptake profile for your technology and the usage rates. So the population is broad, not everyone speaks English, not everyone can see or hear, or they might have physical disabilities, or they might not be digitally literate. They might be old, they might not have an iPhone, they might not have a smartphone, for instance. And even within if you have medical end users, not all doctors are digitally literate. They might not have access to the hospital computers on a regular basis. They might not have an iPhone with internet reception, internet connection within the hospital where they work. So you have to think about the connectivity as well. And if your software actually interacts with hardware or another type of device, you have to obviously think about access to those devices and maintaining that access. And then there's also cybersecurity considerations about how you make sure that the data that is flowing between that hardware device and your software device is cyber secure and compliant with GDPR as well. So the standard covers all of those considerations, which would also be covered by your intended use, including exclusions for use. The next standard we're going to look at, next slide please, is standard 14. And again, this is for TSC devices that are software as a medical device. If you inform or drive clinical management, you're likely to be class 2A. Class 2B, you could be at driving, and if you're diagnosing, you could be class 2B or even class 3. Especially if you are intending to be a standalone diagnostic device, where a clinician relies solely on the output of your device to make a diagnosis, you will quite likely be class 3, especially if those diseases or conditions that you're diagnosing have a morbidity or mortality associated with them. So for instance, if you are diagnosing stroke on a CT scan, that would most likely be a class 3 device, because stroke is a critical or severe condition. And the evidence, as we've spoken to before, can be different. The evidence requirements can be different. So for informing clinical management, where you might be clinical decision support, where a clinician can look at the output of your device and choose to accept or ignore it, and might adjust their treatment plan or diagnostic decision-making process based on the output of your device, you need to show that in real-world evaluations that you are actually able to provide clinical utility to a certain level of claimed accuracy. So you've done your studies to show what your benchmark accuracy is, and that you maintain that accuracy post-market. For driving clinical management, the NICE framework suggests you should have one or more high-quality studies to support your claim benefits, done in the UK. So if you're an international manufacturer, it's not enough to show that it works on American or Spanish patients. You have to show it works within the UK healthcare system, and show that the improvements are in those relevant outcomes, such as your accuracy, your time to diagnosis, or other outcomes, are all measured appropriately. And you might not do that in one study, as they say, you can do that in multiple studies. And going back to what we talked about before in terms of documentation, you'd have multiple CIPs, multiple CIRs that feed into your clinical evaluation report. And again, if you're diagnosing, they recommend one or more high quality studies, again, designed explicitly to support the claim benefits of your test. And again, the outputs and the things you might be measuring might be accuracy against an appropriate reference standard, or against an appropriate comparator cohort to show that you're in good agreement with standard practice. We'll move on to standard 15 now. And again, going back to real world evidence, again, this is based on real world data. It's the best practice for TSC devices, but also there's a concept called service provision. So if you are a low tier DHT, not a medical device, let's say you're a booking system, you might not need to do a clinical investigation, but the real world evidence is to show that your booking system actually works in the real world and people are able to use it. And you might do that in a sort of a service provision surveillance kind of framework. And you might collect this data at the start from pilot sites, and you can confirm all of those things that are listed there. But then you might want to progress into wider deployments and continue to collect that real world data. And again, it's important to document and have those conversations with your purchasers of how are you going to collect this real world data. You may even need ethical approval to do so if you're doing it under a clinical investigation or post-market clinical investigation in your PMCF plan. We'll move on to standard 16 now. And this is important mainly for AI-driven devices where the performance can change over time, not because your algorithm is changing, but because the environment in which your algorithm is deployed can change. And as we've said, that can be due to the IT environment changing, but also the clinical environment changing. As I mentioned, COVID, it was a new disease that appeared and chest X-ray AI devices weren't trained to pick up COVID. So they may have had to update to include training data for COVID positive patients. So in your post-market clinical follow-up plan, but also under the NICE evidence standards framework, it's recommended to have a plan for ongoing data collection to monitor the usage within that target population, but also how to collect anonymized aggregate data to show that the outcomes that you're claiming, and including the financial ones, are actually being met. So this is going to be a really interesting part, I think, of future software as a medical device evaluations coming to market. And a big focus of health technology assessments by NICE will be looking at how do we actually safely and accurately monitor for changes in performance over time. The current medical device regulations do allow you to tweak the performance of your device, as I mentioned, as long as you are staying within your intended use, as long as the population is not changing, as long as the target disease and the end users are not changing, you can tweak the performance of your device over time. So those are the clinical standards that we wanted to pick out, but obviously we do advise you to read the whole NICE evidence standards framework. There are 21 standards to look at, and do not forget the health economic ones either. That's going to be important for you as manufacturers going forward. I'm going to hand over to Ankit to summarize, and I think then we will have another brief break, and then we'll move on to the Q&A session. And we have prepared a case study, but we're also welcome to run through potential case studies with audience members. But I'll hand over to Ankit just to summarize this section.
Thanks, Hugh. So to summarize, we had that slide which showed the 6 steps, starting from conceptualization, going all the way to demonstrating how you're going to deliver value. But actually, as part of conceptualization, and even before that, you really want to think, what unmet clinical need am I trying to fill? And how am I going to deliver this value that, I'm going to develop this tool so that I can demonstrate benefit to the healthcare system. So to do that, it's really important to first get clear on your product's uses and what features are you going to implement to have specific benefits that you've described. Next is to decide and plan how you're going to demonstrate that your product with those features will be safe and effective all the way through the development cycle. So through prototyping, through bench testing, and then finally in a pivotal clinical investigation, and then in the post-market setting. So this clinical evaluation process really happens throughout the product lifecycle, and it's not just a single trial to demonstrate effectiveness. And it's not, in that context, a tick box exercise. It's something that should really be ingrained in the way you develop software that's going to have a medical purpose. And as discussed very briefly, high-level strategy is really key. So have a look at the big picture and align your clinical evaluation process with your economic value proposition. See how best you can design studies to be able to collect preliminary economic data as well as clinical outcome data, because they very much complement each other. And this is important for both buyers and investors into these into software as medical device companies. And we recommend you read the ESF, as Hugh suggested, if you're planning to bring your device into the NHS or the UK market, because as we discussed, it's kind of a framework that's been designed to help commissioners decide which products they want to buy and not. So we've got a 5 to 10 minute break. And then if anybody has any questions, we can leave the floor open to start with questions. And if not, we have some prepared case studies, one on radiology AI and one for digital therapeutics in the context of sleep. But we're more than happy to forego those if people have more questions of specific things that they're working on that might be more interesting and fruitful. So maybe we'll come back in 10 minutes for the final sort of half an hour, 40 minutes, and then take things from there.
Yeah, let's come back at 11:25.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's 11:25, so we'll make a start. I think what we'll try and do is focus on questions that the audience has first. So there's a question in the chat, which I'll address in a moment, but please feel free to also raise your hand and have a chat with us directly if you prefer to do that instead of writing long questions on the chat. We're more than happy to have a conversation. And if we run out of questions, then we can move on to a couple of optional case studies. But if not, we'd like to focus more on the questions that you have, and that might make it a bit more interactive and help answer some specific queries that you might have. So we'll start with the first question from Aditya. I'm currently looking at adverse event reporting for AIMD across 3 jurisdictions. Initial AE numbers are relatively low compared to AIMD approval rates. How are AI manufacturers addressing adverse event reporting, given that it can be far more complex to identify and report adverse events associated with AIMD compared to drugs and surgical devices? No, that's a really, really good question, a really good point. I think there's a few answers that kind of may explain the initial lack of what we see as adverse event reporting on, for example, MAUD. And you're absolutely right. A lot of the adverse events that are reported are often to do with system failures rather than necessarily clinical false positives and false negatives in the case of using these kinds of AI devices. So I think the first reason may be that a lot of deployed AI as a medical device software is currently sort of designed in a way where it's being used as clinical decision support, and there's still a significant amount of clinical oversight in the use of these devices. And I assume it would be a very small minority which are completely independent devices, which may not necessarily be the case, for example, for some physical devices or drugs. Secondly, I think it is quite a nascent space. So, as time progresses, we'll probably be able to see more information come through. And that kind of links to the third point of the increased importance that's now being placed on real world evidence, which you discussed briefly a few minutes ago, particularly in the case of AI, where you want to think about performance drift and variability across sites. And, I think the trouble is at the moment, infrastructure to be able to collect solid real world evidence in a post-market setting is tricky. And there are companies that are working towards sort of having tools that help end users report false positives and false negatives. And so within post-market surveillance and within the actual design of these AI tools, we're now seeing a lot of emphasis being put on how we can use the interfaces to have automatic reporting for users to be able to send a notification to the manufacturer, for example, in the case of a false positive, or what they deem to be a false positive and a false negative. And having those mechanisms of collecting that real world data, I think will help to give us a better understanding of what the real world adverse events may be in the use of AI as a medical device. Hugh, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
I can give a kind of couple of examples, and then Aditya will listen to you as well. So with AI as a medical device, obviously you are providing an output intended to be viewed by a clinician at some point, and that clinician can either accept or reject that output. So some manufacturers are putting a little toggle next to every single output saying agree or disagree. And some of them are then opening, if you disagree, they open up a little box which allows you to type in why you disagree and how serious you think that error might be. And that goes back to the manufacturer. So that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is a bit more old-fashioned, sort of based on the yellow card system that we have for drugs, where people are asked to fill in adverse events for each and every case. That is possible, but I think with AI as a medical device, it's not really robust enough. And I think that addresses the concern that you have in your question there. The other way that people are doing it is sort of semi-automating it. So I've seen some AI manufacturers build back-end natural language program or NLP systems, for instance, to look at a radiology or a pathology report and pull out all the words from that report and compare that to what the output of the AI device was, and try and get a sort of agreement or disagreement rate as well. But of course, you then have to prove that your NLP has a certain level of accuracy and is robust and isn't drifting. So that system comes with a new level of things. Here we go. I'm going to ask you to unmute and then we can have a chat.
Great, yeah. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Thanks for the fantastic workshop. Really enjoyed it so far. And yeah, thanks for kind of giving an answer to that question, which has been kind of a great deal of interest for me. So I think I know which company you're talking about in terms of the NLP, and I'm trying to figure out exactly what the details are for their NLP and how they're measuring the performance of the NLP to then tell us the performance of the device itself. So yeah, really interesting stuff. One of the things that I've been coming across are kind of clinical evaluations such as RCTs of, let's say, a mental health chatbot or any other digital therapeutic. And so I'm finding that, yes, there is this really interesting way to automate some of the adverse event reporting. But then where does that adverse event report actually go? Is it something that manufacturers will always report, or are there certain things that won't be reported and certain things that will go to regulators? And the second question is whether you've had any experience with kind of mental health chatbots and how the adverse events are being picked up with those, because obviously that can become even more complex. And so there's that differentiation between AI and MD for diagnostic, and we talk about false negatives and false positives, but then also digital therapeutics, and that just brings a whole host of new questions. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great questions. So yeah, digital therapeutics are, well, by their definition, intending to provide therapy, so they're trying to change a treatment outcome. And so the adverse event can be that treatment outcome is suboptimal or incorrect, or at least a harm. And when you're designing your regulatory documentation and indeed your clinical follow-up, you should have documented what you will define as an adverse event as opposed to a serious adverse event. Where do you report those to? So adverse events should be reported back into your clinical evaluation report and into your benefit risk matrix. Serious adverse events should be reported on regulatory databases. So a theoretical example, let's say there's a mental health chatbot and someone uses it but then commits suicide 2 hours later. That could be potentially considered as a serious adverse event. How that gets reported, preferably there'd be a clinician or someone prescribing that device who would then make that connection that actually they had used this device, it didn't work, the patient committed suicide. That would be a serious adverse event because it's led to a patient death. And then the company might conduct an internal investigation. Well, was it the device that led to the suicide, or was the patient kind of not appropriate for the therapy and was misprescribed advice? You have to do a root cause analysis in regulatory terms to figure out what caused that serious adverse event. In terms of like maybe a radiology AI or something equivalent in pathology or cardiology, for instance, a serious adverse event might be missing a bundle cancer on a scan or something like that, which clearly is not suboptimal. And that would be up to the radiologist to click the toggle button if there's one available, or that NLP, as we discussed, to pick it up. Where it gets complicated is where you don't find out the adverse event till further downstream. So for instance, let's say you're a prediction algorithm, you're predicting someone will have Alzheimer's early onset. You might not know for 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
And it's questionable whether anyone will remember what your prediction algorithm said when the patient finally gets Alzheimer's. So incredibly tricky in that context. And I don't think I can give you a reasonable answer because I don't think anyone knows yet.
Fair enough. Really interesting stuff. And thank you very much.
I actually predict that post-market monitoring for adverse events of software medical devices is going to be a market in and of itself.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting to hear. Fine. I'll, at some point, it would be great to feedback some of the work I'm doing. So, but yeah, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you. Do you want to take the next written question?
Sure. So what do regulators look at when it comes to traceability, auditability, and reproducibility when it comes to the analysis that was done during the clinical investigation phase? And how is the best way to represent this information to regulators? So there are provisions within the ISO standard, ISO 14155, which is particularly about the clinical investigations surrounding medical devices, that account for what is required in terms of auditability and traceability. A lot of it relates more to physical devices, so being able to say, okay, what was the actual, identification number of that specific device that was used for this patient or in this population. So in case there are any adverse events, that they can be traced to a particular device. Less applicable for software, but you still need to have sort of version control and know which version of software was used. And in the instance of perhaps personalized software tools, the same sort of notification of what instance of that software was being used should be recorded. And in terms of, I'm not sure what you mean by reproducibility. Maybe you want to unmute and expand on that, but as long as you essentially demonstrate that you're following GCP practices and ISO 14155, which are mentioned within the regulations, then those, as long as those provisions are met, then that would sort of meet regulatory requirements.
I think it's also important to mention that there are non-regulatory but academically produced standards, apologies, for trial design and reporting of design. And I've been involved with work produced by excellent panels through Delphi Consortium to produce things such as Spirit and Consort AI, which is best practice for AI RCT design and AI reporting for RCTs. Apologies. Also, if you're presenting a diagnostic device, there's the STARD AI, there's Probase. There's all sorts of academic standards as well, which should hopefully, if you follow it, ensure that you are complying with the things that you've mentioned.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Any hands? I can't see any hands. Sorry. I might need to rely on Hugh or Rosie to. No. Okay. Should we do a quick case study to try and put things together and give a brief overview of how everything that we've talked about fits into what goes into developing particularly software-based tools. So we've got a couple of case studies, but if any more questions come up, we can always pause and answer some more questions. So as a brief example, as we have been talking a little bit about radiology, we'll define very quickly an example radiology AI tool. So this is, as an example, let's say this is an AI tool for detecting abnormalities on chest X-rays. So this would very clearly fall under the tier C of the NICE ESF, because it's identifying signs of a disease or a condition and maybe used to guide next treatment or interventions. And so in the intended use of this radiology AI device, you would need to say, for example, whether you are going to have a heat map or a contour that shows where exactly the pathology is, or whether it doesn't say any of that, but just sort of flags a binary abnormal versus abnormal, or whether it's being used to triage a workflow of a radiologist, or whether it's meant to be used as an assistive tool or a second read, for example. And as we've already been through, because it's a Tier C device, Tier C digital health technology under the NICE evidence standards framework, it would also be a medical device. So we'll come back to this slide just to refresh the product development cycle of the device once we've written the intended use and conceptualized what features are going to be needed to deliver the benefits we intend, and then think about how we're going to validate those benefits. So first, we'll start with the evidence review. So the questions we need to think about, for example, if it's a deep learning based tool, is to say, what is the performance of deep learning in terms of detecting a particular abnormality on a chest X-ray? And is there a scientific association between the output of deep learning X-ray in terms of classification, for example, and the actual presence of a disease as defined by the gold standard? So whether that's a radiologist reporting it, a suitably qualified radiologist reporting it, or whether it's a biological ground truth, for example, pneumonia. And then you want to think about what the equivalent devices might be and what the current pathways and standards are for chest X-ray reporting. And we'll come to the importance of that a little bit later. And from the perspective of delivering economic value, what are the health, cost, and resource impacts compared to the current standard of care? So this really comes down to why are you building this tool and what unmet need are you trying to to fulfill? So let's say you've defined it and you've done an evidence review, which tells you the best study design for your particular device, and it tells you what expected performance you're intending to have. And you've developed your software and you've demonstrated a prototype version of the tool works through sort of training and a small holdout internal test set. You've gone through analytical validity, showing that each feature, so for example, we've been talking about, is there a feature for PMS, post-market surveillance, yes, no, and open text box for any discrepancies? Does that unit of the software work? Does the heat map or the contouring work? So that's all analytical validity. And then finally, you want to think about conducting a study to demonstrate the clinical performance. So in this example, let's say you've defined your population as adults who get a chest X-ray. Depending on where you are in your study design and depending on what claims you make, this may be a retrospective or prospective study. For example, if it's adults who get a chest X-ray in the emergency department, you may need to, and one of your claims is reduced turnaround time of reporting or increased turnaround speed of patients within A&E, then that may need to have a prospective design. Your literature review and the estimated effect size will help you determine what sample size is suitable to do that. And also you need to think about making sure that your sample is representative of the intended population that's going to be subject to that device in the real world. And also really important to think about specific exclusion criteria. So for example, in radiology, that might be, are there specific implants which might distort the image? In cardiology, it might be, if you're using an ECG analysis AI, do you want to output reports of arrhythmias on paced rhythms, or will your AI not be trained on that and not output correct results on that particular population? Then we think about our intervention, which is a radiology AI detection tool, which we've described. And in terms of our control and comparator, we need to think of an appropriate ground truth, which we've also touched on as probably an appropriately qualified radiologist as ground truth. Something to think about is the number of radiologists or the number of healthcare professionals in whatever context that are being used for ground truth. So oftentimes there may be reader disagreement where there is subjectivity in what's determined to be ground truth. And so in those instances, and in those kinds of studies, it's really important to think about how you're going to mitigate against that. So do you have 2 or 3 radiologists reviewing each scan and then taking the consensus opinion, or having a tie-break expert healthcare professional to determine finally what the ground truth will be labeled as? And then of course, we've described, is this going to be a crossover design? So in the case of a multi-reader case study or a reader study, or any sort of AI assistance, the healthcare professionals involved in ground truthing shouldn't be the ones involved in the prospective reader study. So you may need 2 sets of healthcare professionals, depending on what you're trying to claim. And of course, for example, if there is a biological ground truth, then what is the gold standard test? So for example, if you are developing a new AI-based serum diagnostic for colorectal cancer, what is your ground truth going to be in that instance? Is the gold standard colonoscopy or biopsy, for example? And then you need to think about the outcomes. And so, as we said, if it's AI assisted, then you need to have a reader study, standalone AI performance, and then you need to perhaps think about, is there any additional metrics you want to consider? So for example, do you want to make the claim of reduced turnaround time or reduced reporting time? And this is where clinical context and identifying an unmet need becomes really important. So let's just take a perhaps slightly unrealistic example, but let's say, the initial intended use is to detect abnormalities on a chest X-ray, and your study also aims to prove that patient turnaround time in A&E is improved by this. So, depending on trusts, certain X-rays may not necessarily be reported, and the intended user is a radiologist. Certain X-rays may not be reported on the same day, and so thinking about turnaround time of patients may not make sense in the context of where the study is being done or in the context of the intended use of the device. For example, if it was a CT head or a more urgent scan, then turnaround time might make more sense as an economic driver of what you're trying to build. So this is where really the outcomes that you decide on are driven by the value that you intend to deliver in the specific context you intend to deliver it. Another thing to touch on separate to radiology AI is, for example, for more advanced diagnostic tests, oftentimes in a AI or deep learning context in an academic setting, there are outcome measures which are preferred. So for example, F1 scores and other kind of harmonic means, which are incredibly helpful in terms of understanding the balance of sensitivity and specificity. But when you're thinking in a clinical perspective and from a regulatory perspective, what's important to keep in mind is the risks of false positives and false negatives. And in that context, the outcome you measure should allow anyone reading the report, the clinical investigation report, to understand, at a fundamental level, what the risks are with the rate of false positives and false negatives. So in some cases, harmonic mean outcomes such as F1 or AUC may not necessarily be sufficient to demonstrate the safety of a particular device, whether it's an AI tool or a diagnostic or any sort of analysis tool of any sort of clinical data, that's ECGs, for example. So clinical context is really important, and thinking about it from a clinical perspective is really important. And now, just as we've already discussed this with Aditya, actually, thinking about what are the ways in which we can have plans for data collection in the real world. So user interface options for reporting technical issues, as well as incorrect labeling. We've talked about that. And to be able to do that, as you mentioned, you may need to have agreements with partner sites for sampling over a continuous period, or a few weeks per year, for example, and then having a set of independent radiologists review it, or an independent set of healthcare professionals in a non-radiology case. And obviously, those patients would need the consent or the required ethical approval to be able to do that. And then oversights or between sites, having suitable methods of aggregation to make sure that we can improve service delivery across the system and not just within integrated care services, for example. So maybe that gave a brief overview of some points to touch on across developing these kinds of tools and how it fits into health economics and developing the clinical evidence needed to demonstrate value in a pre and post-market setting. I'll just pause for now if there's any other questions. We've got 10 minutes left roughly, so I'm not sure if we'll have time for the second case study.
What we can do, Anki, is go to the references slide and just explain why we've included each one, because as someone has said, someone's linked a document which contains a lot of the references we're about to show.
Oh, and I did forget to mention that the ESF does have specific considerations for AI, which, as we discussed, may not be fully implemented yet, but there is provisions for recommendations of how to do that. Sure. Okay, so I'll move on to the reference slide.
So I wanted to point out that the medical device regulations are laws, but there's also guidance produced by the MDCG. And this guidance is constantly updated. I highly recommend, if you are a medical device manufacturer, to subscribe to updates from the MDCG. Not all updates will be relevant to software as a medical device, but some of them will be. And they have guidance on best practices for clinical evaluation of medical devices. And they've updated it recently in 2024 to include software as a medical device, as well as the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, which is the IMDRF, and they have specific guidance on SAMD clinical evaluation. So those two documents should also be read earlier rather than later, I think, in the process, the better. And then there's a couple of other resources that we recommend. We've got a blog on our website about literature reviews. And we are also very happy to take any inquiries or calls or to any independent developers to help them with that. The PRISMA guidelines, not mandated by the regulations, but are considered by the auditors to be best practice. And they will often ask, have you done it to PRISMA? Have you reported your literature review to PRISMA standards? And having a PRISMA flowchart is very useful. We mentioned GCP, so we do recommend that you work either with GCP trained qualified professionals or internally within your team or company undergo a GCP training course. I think they're about a 2-day long training course, and you can do those separately and get certified for GCP. The qualification, I believe, lasts 2 or 3 years, so you do need to update it regularly. The mandatory standard that you will need to purchase and have a copy of for when you get audited is ISO 14155. A small caveat, because of Brexit, we now have a slightly different version called BS ISO 14155, which is the British standard, which you'll need to buy if you want to get a UKCA mark. If you need a CE mark, you need the EN standard, so the European Nation standard for that. And again, if you're not sure which standards to buy, you can reach out to us and we can guide you. Always be in contact with the MHRA. They are the regulatory body in charge of this stuff in the UK. They are very happy to take questions, and they will sometimes, for a fee, give feedback as well on early submissions. And they can even help with clinical investigational design and bring expert panels together. So they have a paid-for service for that, as does NICE. So you can do early technology evaluations through NICE, and I believe they have a fee for a paid-for service where they can advise on best practice clinical investigational design as well. We've linked obviously to the NICE Evidence Standards Framework, which we've created extensively in this talk. And then finally, there's a very useful tool produced by the HRA entitled Is My Study Research? So for those of you who are not sure when your study actually counts as research, when you will need to do an ethics submission, there's a tool there with guidance on that. So I hope all of that information is useful to you all. And I hope the webinar, not just this one, but the other 3 that we've done, covering regulatory, intellectual property, and health economics. If you've watched all of those webinars, you should be well equipped to approach the market as a responsible software as a medical device manufacturer. And I'd just like to say at this point, thank you so much for HDR UK for having us on board and allowing us to share our expertise with everyone and all of you. So please do stay in touch. We have one more question very quickly from Lydia. Is a usability study really needed for a class 1 SAMD? Good question. It will, again, depend on your intended use. And it will depend on a literature review. So has a similar device with similar user interface and functionality got evidence to show that it is safe and effective? If it doesn't, then you may well need to do a usability study. Or if you've designed a new interface, you may well need to do a formative usability study for your class 1 device. Again, you don't necessarily need to be audited, though the regulators can ask to see your documentation at any point once you declare that you are on market. So I hope that helps. Thank you for the lovely feedback coming in. To those of you that have watched all the webinars, you now have 12 hours of content. There are bite-sized videos coming out on the HDR UK channels as well. And I believe, Rosie, we'll be doing some in-person workshops as well in the future with you guys as well. So I'm hoping that together we can all just bring software as a medical device and health tech forward as an industry and encourage responsible best practice. So thank you so much, Rosie, for having us.
Thank you so much, Hugh and Ankit, for that brilliant session. I really hope you all enjoyed it. And yeah, that concludes the series of webinars on bringing your software as a medical device to market. But like Hugh's mentioned, there is a series of bite-sized videos being released on the platform. And we will also be running some workshops in the future. So to receive all of that information, we'll be sending a post-event email around, which will have links to the recordings of all of these sessions, plus the videos. And we will also invite you to subscribe to our monthly e-bulletin if you didn't already sign up. And in that, we'll be forwarding relevant information and updates, including HDR UK training events, but also other relevant events and training going on in the health data science world. So do keep an eye out for that newsletter. So also we are on Twitter and LinkedIn. So I think my colleague James is hopefully popping some links into the chat right now to our Twitter feed and LinkedIn page. We'll also put links to those in the post-event email as well for anyone who doesn't catch those. And yeah, just to wrap up there, we'll give you 5 minutes back, finishing slightly early, but I really hope you enjoyed today's session. And if you do have any questions, you can contact us at learn@hdruk.ac.uk, but we'll also include Hugh and Ankit's emails into the post-event email too. So if you do have any questions for Hugh and Ankit that you didn't get a chance to ask today, I'm sure they're very happy to receive emails from you as well. So I really hope you will enjoy the rest of the day, and thanks very much for joining.